I'm not usually the type to buy into a media frenzy, and I live in New England, and that old pragmatic Yankee blood still runs through my veins. So when I first heard about these crazy clown sightings all around the country, my belief in them was very limited. What I did know is that this new trend isn't really new. Clowns have been lurking in public places before this recent backlash of events, and even once there was a chaotic frenzy in Chicago a few years back almost miming this exact situation. I figured most of this is a mix of dumb kids trying to scare their neighbors and those same dumb neighbors being stupid enough to fall for it. If anything, my biggest worry was having a thug dressed up in a clown trying to make the most of this trend and try to shake me down with a big smile and a stupid red nose on his face. Honestly, I'd be more worried for him than me. That Yankee confidence always has been my forte, so to speak. Anyways, last night I spent the evening at an old friend's house across town. We don't live in a city, but it's not all country either. However, there is a good stretch of unlit roads, and you'd be hard-pressed to call anything there more than a town. I am a responsible and healthy kind of a guy, so knowing that I'd be having a few beers, I decided to walk over there after work, hoping that my fiancée would be able to pick me up after, and knowing that if not, I should probably get more cardio in anyways. It was a typical Friday night with beers, campfire, and the guys, which was a weekly occurrence for us to get away from our respective significant others for some time. Before long, it was well after midnight. Knowing that I had already overstayed my welcome by at least a full six-pack, I denied my friend's offer to crash on his couch and began the walk home, shooting my fiancée a text to update her on my plans as I left and hoping that she would still be awake to provide a ride. No such luck. It's a pretty long walk, about 35 minutes, but there are sidewalks and street lamps most of the way, so it's not all unbearable. I buttoned up my coat and said my goodbyes and started walking. It was a brisk night, but I didn't mind it, and I had a nice buzz going along with my coat to keep me warm. As is the typical plan when walking home after a night out, I put my headphones in and just kind of spaced out as I traveled. I occasionally checked my phone for text, but nothing. This wasn't the kind of town you needed to worry about getting jumped in. In fact, it's the kind of place where the only reason you'd want your headphones off is in case a friendly neighbor yelled to offer you a ride, and if you didn't answer, it would look kind of unkind. I stayed in my spaced out phase until I had to pass the woods, which was a particularly dark stretch of road. There is a sidewalk on one side with a handful of street lamps pulling light in front of the houses, but on the other side it is a pretty thick stretch of woods with no light, no houses, and no developments. It's basically a swamp that's too expensive to build on, so it's just kind of remained untouched. Every time I get to this strip, I tend to perk up a little bit, and not because I'm worried about some ghoulish creature grabbing me from the woods, but because of drunk drivers. This stretch of road is long, straight, and dark, a perfect place for a young driver to think they should rev up their engines. At least once a year, some kid is struck by a car here, usually by a fellow high schooler partying out late at night. Occasionally, small crosses and bouquets of flowers will be left near the sites of their accidents as constant reminders. So when I thought I heard the sound of a quick honk behind me, I was ready, and I basically jumped off the sidewalk onto a lawn of the house that I was in front of. Pulling out my headphones in the process, I turned to throw a finger at whatever would be blowing by me in their car. There was nothing there. I stood up and looked around. Pulling out my headphones really heightened the silence of the night, and I heard the creaking of the trees in the woods as the wind swept through them. Down the road both ways I could see nothing, save for little pinpoints of darkness on both ends where my sight could not reach. Chalking it up to a nervous imagination, I took one last look down the road and then put my headphones back in. Walking between the pools of yellow light on the sidewalk, it wasn't 2 minutes before I heard it again. I didn't get startled this time, and I merely just looked behind me to check for cars. Still nothing. I popped my headphones back in my ear and continued on my journey. A loud honk sounded in my ear so close behind me that I could swear I felt the movement of air from the horn. I turned and I swung. I'm not sure at what, but I landed nothing. I regained my balance and immediately pulled out my headphones ready for anything. There was nothing save for the wind and darkness of the night around me. That time I knew I wasn't imagining it. The honk wasn't like a car horn, but like a kid's bike horn. The thought of one of those punks dressed up as a clown behind me quickly crossed my mind, but I forced a smile and said, not only was I in a tiny New England town where the rowdiest people were bored cops, but I could blatantly see for a quarter of a mile in each direction, and I was alone. Seeing no reason to stop, I began to walk again, put my headphones in, and I had gotten back to the groove of my music when I heard a slight squeak from behind me. Figuring at this point it was a car, and already having the heck scared out of me twice, I wasn't too surprised. That's when I saw what may be hands down the most mind-twisting, terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. A glimpse of movement caught my eye to the left, and I turned, expecting some automobile filled with high school kids. Instead, it was a fully grown man, dressed up in a cartoonish clown costume, patiently cycling a child's tricycle down the dark country road I was walking. He didn't look over, didn't falter, wave, or even acknowledge me. He just kept his eyes straight on the road, his hands on the handlebars, and near silently past me slowly, save for the light squeaking of the unoiled wheel bearings. I stopped with my mouth gaped open, and I watched as he slowly pedaled through the pool of light given off by the street light and into the darkness between the next. I waited a minute, but he didn't pass through on the other side. I was given a pretty tough choice here. Turn around and face my back to this jerk, or go through the forest on my left to avoid this jerk and likely sprain my ankle and ruin new shoes in the swamp, or walk right up to him in the dark and face him. Maybe it was the drunk confidence, or the fact that I just really hated this stupid media clown trend, but like every horror movie cliche, I chose the last one. I walked carefully through a pool of yellow light given off by a street lamp. Toward the edge, I looked out into the shadows beyond. Beyond the light, I could see the faintest outlines of a silhouette in the distance. I stepped out of the light and into the shadows to get a better view. It was him, all right. His silhouette, anyways, just sitting there on his tricycle toward the end of the road with his back to me. I walked up carefully, putting my iPhone flashlight, which provided next to no light. I got almost close enough to touch him when I smelled it. The stench coming from this guy was absolutely terrible. He smelled like crap and rotting meat. I gagged and almost threw up. I had gotten this far, though, and moved a little bit closer, touching him on the left shoulder. "Hey, buddy, are you okay?" The light on my phone was just strong enough for me to make out some features in the dark. His clothing was definitely clown-like and looked remarkably clean. Ridiculous red hair covered his head, and a white skin on the bald part of his head looked like rubber. I stepped closer, realizing it was a mask, but still he didn't move. "Listen, buddy, I'm not sure what you're trying to do, but..." I touched him on the shoulder at that moment, and he began to slump, slowly at first, then he picked up his speed by hitting the ground with a wet thud. His bright-colored clown suit burst open, and the mask split, and the smell hit me so hard that I literally did throw up. Spilling out from his garments and all over the streets were piles of rotting something, covered in maggots, blood, and bugs. In the mass of rotting flesh, I caught sight of something shiny. Seeing it was a ring that was still attached to a finger, from an impossible height above me, one word rang out: Mortem. M-O-R-T-E-M. I twisted around, and there he was again, standing behind me. The fake rubber skin of his mask looked even more haggard in the dim light. Where his eyes should have peeked through the eye holes was just darkness, with fluids of rotting something raining down from them like tears. His hand was raised up, holding a small child's bicycle horn, and he honked it 3 times. My fight or flight system kicked in, and I did the only thing I realized I could do. I landed the hardest punch I had ever thrown square into his round red nose. The hit landed square in the face, but I kept going. It felt like I watched it in slow motion as I watched my fist hit his face, then watched his face like rubber, and my fist kept going through it. In a flash, I had both of my hands back up, his face still slightly sagging from where I hit it, but the elasticity of it was quickly bringing it back to form. He began a muffled, throaty laugh. With my fight or flight system still in full force, I did the other thing that I could do. I bolted out of there. As I moved down the street, I heard laughter coming from the woods to the right. I caught a quick glimpse of him in different poses, hanging from nooses in the trees or a crumbled pile on the ground, always looking at me from the darkness of the woods with his empty eyes. I kept my head down and ran. When I got to my apartment, I unlocked the door as fast as I could. I made it inside. I turned on every light and then I deadbolted the door behind me. I tried calling my fiancée but got no answer. I was breathing heavily at this time. I walked around my apartment and on the kitchen table was a note. Went out with the girls. Might be back later than you. Love you. That was written on a small scrap of paper, but placed next to it on the kitchen table was a bulbous red clown's nose.